Have you ever wondered what it takes for someone to finally say, enough, when the entire world expects them to give just one more time? It's a question I never thought I'd ask myself, not from a sunlit corner of a modest walk-up on Park Avenue, especially not after the life I once lived. My name is Eleanor Harrington. In another lifetime, I was the quiet heiress of one of Manhattan's most prominent real estate families. People saw the designer coats, the black tie fundraisers, the doormen who greeted me by name. But what they didn't see, what no one ever bothered to ask, was how much I paid for everyone else's comfort. Not just in money, but in silence. In the slow erosion of dignity that comes when you're expected to carry what others drop without a second thought. Today, the only sound in my apartment is the slow drip of a French press and the distant hum of the city. It's peaceful now. But the road to that peace was anything but. This is the story of how I was raised to be the pillar that held my family together, until I realized they were never holding me up in return. And what happened when I finally let go. The Harrington name carried weight in Manhattan. Our family wasn't just wealthy, we were entrenched. Real estate, oil, even a stake in the mayor's campaign once. Our name opened doors others couldn't find. My father, Edward Harrington, built the empire brick by brick, dollar by dollar, reputation by reputation. But while the city saw him as a visionary, I saw a man who measured affection in terms of utility. Growing up in that house on East 72nd Street felt like living in a museum. Grand staircases, walnut bookcases filled with untouched first editions, and a chandelier in the foyer that had once hung in a Venetian palace. My mother, Margaret, kept the place like a cathedral, silent, gleaming, and cold. I learned early on that the only way to be noticed in the Harrington household was to be useful. Not charming like Thomas, my eldest brother, who had inherited our father's silver tongue and used it to cover every financial mistake he ever made. Not artistic like Wallace, who fancied himself a painter, though he hadn't sold a canvas in years. They were adored, excused, protected. I was trained. By the time I turned 25, I had graduated from Barnard with top honors, completed a master's in finance at Wharton, and secured a position at Bellingham & Rowe, one of the top consulting firms in New York. I didn't take a dime from the family trust. I told myself it was out of principle, but the truth was, I needed to know I could survive without them. That decision would become both my shield and my curse. While my brothers floundered, I flourished. I moved into a sleek apartment in Midtown, bought my own car, managed high-profile accounts for Wall Street clients, but with every step I took forward, my family found new ways to remind me that my success was not the kind they celebrated. When Thomas's investment club collapsed in '69 after a string of disastrous decisions, it was I who bailed him out, quietly to avoid public scandal. My father called it family responsibility. When Wallace overdosed in a downtown gallery and ended up in detox, it was I who paid for the private rehab upstate and even covered the tab for his exhibition. Later that year, my mother called it protecting his future. Each time I opened my checkbook, I told myself I was helping, that one day, when I truly needed them, they'd be there too. But it didn't take long before the asks turned into expectations. One day, I received an urgent call from the estate. "Accountant, there was a missing payment on the house staff's salaries." Apparently, the account had been rerouted. When I questioned my father, he looked at me like I had asked him to recite poetry. "Well, darling," he said, not unkindly, "we assumed you wouldn't mind covering it. It's just numbers to you." Numbers. That was all I ever was to them. A ledger that balanced their indulgences. They never asked if I was okay. Never asked why I stayed late at work, or why I sometimes went days without sleep during audits. But when my name came up, it was usually attached to a check or a transfer. My friends, those few I trusted, told me I was enabling them. That maybe If I stopped playing savior, they'd be forced to stand on their own. But they didn't know my family like I did. The Harringtons didn't fall apart. We maintained appearances. We shook hands, smiled at society luncheons, posed for charity galas, and papered over every crack with someone else's sacrifice. Usually mine. And still, I kept giving. When Wallace's apartment caught fire after a party gone wrong, I paid for his new place in Soho. When my mother insisted on repainting the summer estate in Connecticut to impress her bridge group, I funded the renovation under the guise of expanding my investment portfolio. It was always framed as mutually beneficial, and I let it be. Because deep down, some foolish part of me still hoped that if I gave enough, one day they'd look at me the way they looked at Thomas when he returned from yet another failed startup, or Wallace when he brought home another girlfriend with a trust fund and a flair for bohemian rebellion. I wanted to be seen, not just as a resource, but as a daughter. But the truth was already forming beneath the surface, like a hairline crack in fine china. I had built a life around the idea that my usefulness equaled love. And the day I stopped being useful, that illusion would shatter. I just hadn't realized yet how close that day truly was. It started with little things, the kind you dismiss because they wear the face of familiarity. An unfiled receipt. A delayed payment to the housekeeper. A handwritten note tucked into my ledger with a banking instruction that didn't match the original agreement. I brushed it off at first. After all, this was the Harrington household. Nothing ever truly unraveled here. We were the picture of composure. But deep down, something felt wrong, and I could no longer ignore it. One afternoon, while reviewing financials for a client in my office, I noticed a monthly charge to a private schooling institution in Vermont under the Harrington family account, one I never authorized. It turned out to be tuition for Wallace's stepdaughter, whom I had never even met. My name had been quietly attached to the account as a benefactor. I called the estate accountant. He fumbled, then finally admitted, "Your mother said, you'd agreed to it. It was easier than adjusting the trust again." The tone of his voice suggested that arguing would only complicate things. So I swallowed it. Like I had swallowed everything else. These weren't simple mistakes. They were quiet redirections. My name, my accounts, my professional signature were being used like family property. And every time I asked, I received the same soft-spoken justification. "It's all for the family, Eleanor." As if family were an excuse to strip someone's agency piece by piece, transaction by transaction. The final straw in this unraveling thread came one humid evening in July. I had just returned from a 3-day client summit in Boston, bone-tired, still in heels, when I received a call from Thomas. His voice was hurried, almost cheerful. "I handled the thing with the co-op board for the Fifth Avenue apartment," he said. "Don't worry, I used your name to guarantee it. They'll love having a Harrington with real assets behind the deal." I stood frozen in the hallway, the receiver pressed to my ear like a stone. "You used my name?" I asked slowly. "Without asking?" He laughed, unbothered. "You weren't picking up, and it was time-sensitive. I knew you wouldn't mind." There it was again. The assumption that my consent was irrelevant because my reliability was infinite. The next day, I visited our family attorney, Mr. Dreyfus, a loyal, aging man who had managed the Harrington legal affairs for decades. I asked him, as plainly as I could, to explain the extent of my entanglement. His eyes lowered. He opened a file with my initials on it and quietly slid it toward me. That's when I discovered just how far they had gone. My power of attorney, originally intended for emergencies, had been quietly expanded years ago, by request of my mother and signed, allegedly, in my presence. Only I had no memory of such a meeting. The date listed coincided with my trip to Paris for a firm-wide audit. The signature on the page? It looked like mine, but slightly off, like a mirror image drawn from memory. Dreyfus looked uncomfortable. "Sometimes families make administrative decisions for continuity," he said, almost apologetically. I left his office with a folder under my arm and 1,000 unspoken realizations crashing down in my chest. They had used me, not just emotionally, not just financially, but legally. My identity had become a silent passkey to everything they didn't want to be responsible for. That evening, as I sat by the window of my apartment staring out at the hazy Manhattan skyline, I tried to piece together the timeline of betrayals. How many times had I signed just one form under pressure? How often had I transferred funds without question? It was never presented as coercion, always as family. But now I understood. Affection in our house came with ledgers, and my column was always full. Still, I hesitated. Because what does a woman raised to keep the peace do when her silence is finally exhausted? I didn't want to fight. I didn't want scandal. What I wanted, quietly, desperately, was recognition. I wanted someone to admit what they'd done, not just to my accounts but to my dignity. But in the Harrington family, admitting guilt was a weakness. And I had been raised to never appear weak. What I didn't realize was that I was already being set up for the next betrayal. One that would finally crack the golden mask they wore so proudly. One that would teach me the difference between silence and complicity. And it would all come to light at the event we once called the crown jewel of our family legacy, the Harrington Foundation Gala. The Harrington Foundation Gala was the kind of event the city's elite circled on their calendars, months in advance. It wasn't just a fundraiser, it was a declaration. A stage where power was paraded, handshakes carried silent agreements, and old money reaffirmed its place at the top of the social pyramid. That year, the gala was held at the Vanderbilt Ballroom with cascading chandeliers and servers in white, gloves offering caviar on silver trays. The air reeked of floral arrangements and unspoken ambition. I had no desire to be there, but absence would have been its own kind of rebellion, and in our world, rebellion was punished swiftly and subtly. So I wore my navy silk gown, pulled my hair into a low chignon, and arrived precisely 12 minutes after the doors opened, fashionably punctual, just enough to avoid the pre-event camera gauntlet. Inside, everything looked perfect. The Harrington crest gleamed from the backlit wall. My mother fluttered through the room in an ice-blue gown, greeting guests like a practiced empress. My father stood near the mayor, discussing zoning proposals like a man whose empire was still untouchable. And my brothers? Thomas was posted at the bar, laughing too loudly with a group of hedge fund sons. Wallace lingered near the silent auction table, flirting with a woman whose last name was the name of a trust. I kept to myself, sipping champagne and pretending to scan the auction items, hand-painted vases, ski trips to Aspen, portraits by up-and-coming artists. One was Wallace's, predictably listed at $8,000. Then I heard it. I wasn't eavesdropping. Not intentionally. But when you've spent your life listening for danger wrapped in charm, your ears become sharp. Just behind one of the floral arrangements, hidden from view, Thomas's voice broke through the clatter of glasses. "She's like a damn bank with lipstick," he laughed. "Eleanor doesn't even ask anymore. You just drop a number and wait for the wires." A chorus of amused chuckles followed. Then another voice chimed in, Wallace. "She's addicted to being the responsible one. Let her. Makes it easier for the rest of us." I didn't move. I couldn't. My hand tightened around the stem of the glass as if anchoring me to the moment. Their words weren't just cruel, they were casual, practiced. This wasn't the first time they had said it. It was just the first time I'd heard it out loud. I turned and walked away, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. I didn't need a confrontation. I needed clarity. And I had it now. Every loan, every unacknowledged favor, every legal signature used without consent. It wasn't desperation. It was design. I found my mother in the side lounge, delicately adjusting a bracelet while speaking with the editor of a fashion magazine. I waited politely, then leaned in and said softly, "Can we speak? Privately." She excused herself with a smile and followed me into the alcove behind the curtain, where the music faded into a low hum. She looked concerned but composed. "Is something wrong, darling?" I looked at her, really looked. The painted calm, the curated empathy, the same face that had told me I was the pride of the family, even as she signed my name on trust documents I never read. "Did you know Thomas used my name to secure a Fifth Avenue lease?" I asked. Her smile didn't falter. "You weren't answering your phone. It was time-sensitive." "And the forged power of attorney? Was that time-sensitive too?" A pause. Just a flicker. But in the world of high society, a flicker is a confession. "You're overreacting," she said quietly, her voice tightening. "This is what families do. We cover for each other. We protect the legacy." "You didn't protect me. You used me." Her eyes turned cold. The mask dropped. "If you're so burdened by this family," she said, every word sharp and precise, "then perhaps you shouldn't come back." It was not a suggestion. It was a verdict. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I simply stepped back, nodded once, and left the gala without a word to anyone else. No dramatic scene, no raised voice. But as I walked past the valet, past the line of Rolls-Royces and limousines, into the damp Manhattan night, I knew I had just severed something that would not be stitched back. I was no longer the Harrington daughter. I was simply Eleanor. And, for the first time in my life, that felt like enough. The following morning, I didn't wake to the smell of coffee in the Harrington kitchen or the polite murmurs of household staff arranging breakfast trays. I woke in my apartment, a modest, sun-warmed third-floor flat in Greenwich Village, with aching feet, a sore jaw from holding back too many words, and the faint scent of roses still clinging to my gown from the night before. The navy silk dress lay crumpled across a wooden chair, like a fallen banner from a battle I hadn't wanted to fight, but had finally faced. I sat at my small kitchen table, staring into my untouched cup of coffee, and made the quietest decision of my life. One, that would change everything. I would stop. Stop sending money. Stop answering calls. Stop responding to the quiet, manipulative demands dressed as family tradition. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I had finally seen what I hadn't dared to acknowledge for years. I was never family in the emotional sense. I was infrastructure. Invisible, essential, and expected to never fail. That same afternoon, I walked into my bank, pulled my financial records from the last 5 years, and began building what I would come to call the ledger of loss. Every check, every transfer, every mysteriously rerouted expense. I printed copies, stapled receipts, drew timelines. It wasn't about preparing for legal action, at least not yet. It was about confirming I wasn't insane, that I hadn't imagined the thefts cloaked in affection. I also paid a quiet visit to Mr. Dreyfus, our longtime family attorney. I didn't accuse. I inquired. With calm civility, I asked for documentation related to my trust, to the supposed power of attorney adjustments, and to the signature that bore my name but not my memory. He looked pale, offered to clear it up internally. I declined. What I wanted now wasn't to clear things up. I wanted clarity. And distance. Over. The next week, I canceled all standing transfers. I called each of my financial institutions and secured new authentication protocols. I sent one final letter to my mother, typed and signed. All financial support has ceased as of this date. No further transactions authorized. Do not attempt to act in my name again. No accusations. Just a wall. I didn't expect them to. Take it well. But I didn't expect the silence either. No calls, no letters, not even a token protest from Thomas or Wallace. It was as though I'd vanished, and with me, So had the river of quiet funding they had come to depend on. And that silence, so cold, so calculated, hurt more than any shouting match ever could. The first few weeks were disorienting. I wasn't just untethering from a family. I was detaching from a rhythm of self-worth built entirely on being needed. I walked through the village streets, unsure of what to do with myself on weekends. No spreadsheets to review for the estate, no surprise. Repair bills to cover, no brunches where I footed the check under the table. I tried new things. I took a pottery class. I bought a second-hand piano and started playing again. I stayed late at work not out of obligation, but because I wanted to. Not to escape my name, but to embrace my ambition. Slowly, I began to hear myself think again. But it wasn't all relief. Some nights I'd lie in bed and hear my mother's voice in my head. "You're being dramatic, Eleanor." Or worse, "This family has done everything for you." The guilt was like a ghost, slipping under the door, no matter how tightly I locked it. I found myself checking the mail with a pit in my stomach, expecting some formal threat or desperate plea. But nothing came. Until it did. One afternoon, I returned home to find an envelope under my door. No postage. Just my name and my father's. Handwriting. Steady, old-fashioned cursive. Inside, a single sheet of paper. A mortgage payment reminder notice from the Harrington estate's primary property in Connecticut. Scribbled at the bottom were 6 words. "We're counting on you. Don't forget." That was when I realized they hadn't accepted the cutoff. They were simply regrouping, waiting for me to come back to my role. Like an employee on an unpaid leave, expected to eventually return to duty. But I wasn't going back. Not this time. Because for the first time in my life, I was no longer terrified of what would happen if I said no. I was ready to find out. It was 2 months after the envelope appeared when the second sign of their unraveling arrived. This time not by hand, but through the official channel of consequence, an embossed envelope from the Connecticut Property Registry, stamped urgent. I opened it with a slow, deliberate breath. The words inside were sterile, but they carried the heat of betrayal I knew too well by now. Final warning. Primary property at risk of seizure. Mortgage unpaid. Action pending. For a moment, I sat frozen, letting the absurdity of it settle. That house, our family's colonial estate in Fairfield, was supposedly paid off decades ago. My father had called it his crown jewel, a generational asset. But now it was at risk? That didn't make sense. Not unless someone had taken a second mortgage. Not unless someone had done it under someone else's name. I wasn't naive anymore. I no longer believed in family myths. I went to my desk, opened the thick leather folder I'd been building since the night of the gala, and reviewed the records. Between 1972 and early 1974, I had wired over $82,000 to various estate-related accounts: house repairs, taxes, utilities, tuition for Wallace's stepdaughter, even staff payroll. The Connecticut estate had its own fund, and I had sent money directly to it on multiple occasions. There was no possible way the mortgage had fallen behind, unless it was never being paid at all. Determined to know the truth, I called the property registrar and requested an appointment. At first, the clerk was hesitant. But once I provided proof that I had been contributing directly to the Harrington Trust Fund, and that my name was tied to the property management account, she relented. What I learned that day knocked the breath out of me. The original estate mortgage had indeed been paid off in 1966, but in 1971, right around the time Wallace was hospitalized for substance abuse and Thomas's third investment scheme had collapsed, a new line of credit was taken out, using the estate as collateral. The amount, $240,000. The listed signatories, my father and an alternate trustee, authorized via power of attorney. Me. Only, of course, I had never signed that paper. And more disturbing than the loan itself was where the money had gone. Portion had been transferred to an offshore account in the Caymans under Wallace's name, described as creative capital. Another chunk had been absorbed by one of Thomas's silent partnerships in a now-defunct Midtown club. The rest? It was gone, no trail. Just withdrawals marked as family disbursements and estate operational costs. I thanked the clerk, walked calmly out of the office, and sat in my car without starting the engine. My hands trembled on the steering wheel. The air felt thinner. For a brief moment, I imagined my mother's voice if I confronted her. We did what we had to. It was for the family. But this wasn't support. This wasn't mutual sacrifice. This was fraud. I returned home and spent the evening tracing the paper trail on my own. I reviewed every transfer I had made, every dime, every favor, every blind moment of trust. I built a timeline. I highlighted where my funds overlapped with the property's timeline of collapse. The patterns were impossible to ignore, and then came the final insult. In the estate bank account records, public, because of the new foreclosure status, I discovered that the last official mortgage payment had been made 8 months ago. I had still been sending money at the time. For at least 3 of those months, they had taken my deposits under the guise of estate expenses and not used a cent to preserve the very property they claimed was sacred. My hands went cold. It wasn't the money that broke me. It was the deception, the decision to manipulate not just my wallet, but my loyalty. They had risked the house, not because they were desperate, but because they assumed I would never stop saving them. Because they thought I was too guilt-bound, too dutiful to ever look behind the curtain. But I had looked, and now that I had, I could never unsee it. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I opened a new document on my typewriter and began typing. A single sentence I would carry with me into every conversation going forward. To be needed is not the same as being valued. The Harringtons had mistaken my generosity for permanence, but that illusion had now shattered. And with it, so had my silence. In a family like mine, scandal wasn't just feared, it was fatal. We weren't built for exposure, we were built for illusion. Every smile at a gala, every photo in a charity publication, every handshake in a city council meeting was a carefully placed stitch in a garment made to look seamless from the outside. But inside, the fabric was rotting. And now, I had the evidence, in my hands. I didn't rush to court. That's not how these things are done. Not in my world. What I needed wasn't vengeance. What I needed was leverage. I scheduled a private meeting with a former professor of mine, now a partner at one of the most formidable litigation firms in New York. Amelia Rhodes had built her reputation defending women in white-collar financial disputes. She'd dismantled 2 hedge funds, exposed a forged foundation grant, and successfully challenged a multi-million-dollar estate scam in Connecticut. I laid everything on her desk: receipts, bank records, the forged documents from the trust, the notarized signature that had been lifted from my old real estate license. She read in silence for nearly an hour. When she finally looked up, she didn't blink. "They didn't just exploit you," she said. "They stole your legal identity and used it to enrich themselves. This isn't just unethical, it's criminal." That word landed heavily. Criminal. I had spent so long believing what they did was messy, selfish, maybe immoral, but not illegal. Now I saw it for what it was: deliberate fraud, masked by family loyalty and old money decorum, Amelia advised, against a public lawsuit, for now. They'll expect silence, use that. So we moved in secret. A forensic audit team was hired under a separate LLC. We traced every dollar. The offshore transfers, the falsified invoices, the art scholarship that Wallace's girlfriend had received from the family foundation, the trust funds that had been misappropriated through private shell accounts, some even created during years I'd been out of the country. Then came the strategic strike. We filed a quiet motion for injunction on all remaining Harrington estate assets. Simultaneously, Amelia's team submitted a formal petition to revoke the altered power of attorney based on forgery and misuse, which we accompanied, with expert handwriting analysis and dated travel logs that proved I couldn't have signed the documents when claimed. Within 48 hours, the accounts were frozen. The response from my family came not with a phone call, but a letter from their counsel, thinly veiled outrage wrapped in legal pleasantries. They accused me of misunderstanding intentions and threatening the structural integrity of the Harrington name. But they didn't deny the documents were forged. They couldn't. 2 weeks later, the court hearing was scheduled. I arrived not as a daughter seeking reconciliation, but as a plaintiff defending her identity. My father sat in the front row with clenched hands and glassy eyes. My mother refused to look at me. Thomas looked deflated. Wallace didn't show. The courtroom was quiet as Amelia presented our findings. Slide after slide, document after document. Each item a piece of the architecture I had unknowingly funded. And then, when it was my turn, I stood, not with a rehearsed speech, but with calm clarity. I was told that family is everything, I said. That loyalty is sacred, that asking questions made me ungrateful. But loyalty without respect is not family. It's servitude. And I will not serve anyone who thinks my silence is theirs to own. The judge listened, then ruled. The power of attorney was revoked. A formal investigation was opened into the offshore accounts. My legal authority over the trust, originally signed away without my consent, was reinstated. And with that, control of the estate shifted. Over the following months, the press caught wind, discreetly but inevitably. Heiress exposes inheritance fraud, they called it, the quiet storm on Fifth Avenue. I declined interviews. I wasn't interested in becoming a symbol. I was just a woman who finally said no loudly enough for the world to hear. The estate was liquidated slowly. The Connecticut house was sold to a preservation trust. Wallace disappeared to Europe. Thomas was later indicted for perjury. My parents? They settled into a quieter life in upstate New York, removed from the spotlight, where no one asked questions. And I had no interest in revenge. What I wanted was justice, and I got it. Not in fire or fury, but in the quiet way a door finally shuts after being left open too long. When the dust settled, I expected to feel triumphant. I thought justice would bring satisfaction, or at least a sense of finality. But it didn't. Not in the way people imagine. There was no victory dance, no celebratory toast, no cathartic breakdown on a rainy street corner. There was just silence, the kind that follows a long, exhausting war when even the winner walks away limping. I returned to my life in the city, but everything felt different. My name no longer belonged to anyone but me. The trust that once shackled me to a system of invisible servitude was dissolved, and with it, the expectations that had weighed me down since my early 20s. I had always been the invisible architecture behind the Harrington image. Now I had dismantled the house brick by brick, legally and deliberately, until all that remained was truth. Rather than rebuild the family name, I chose to create something new. With the remaining funds recovered from the estate, I established a private foundation, not to restore the Harrington legacy, but to help women like me, educated, accomplished, and quietly exploited under the guise of family duty. The Eleanor Trust was born quietly, but grew quickly. We funded financial literacy programs for women in legacy families, supported legal aid for victims of trust abuse, and hosted private retreats for those who needed to walk away but didn't know how. Didn't make press statements. I didn't stand behind podiums. I simply signed the grants and watched as women found their footing, their voice, their power. In that, I found a purpose beyond retaliation. I found meaning. My parents never reached out again. Neither did Thomas or Wallace. I heard rumors. Wallace had remarried in Vienna. Thomas was appealing his sentence. My mother still played bridge on Thursdays in a club that pretended not to remember the scandal. Occasionally, I would receive old photographs from former staff members. A Christmas card from the gardener. A thank you note from the cook's daughter, whose college tuition I had quietly paid without ever meeting her. They remembered me, not as a Harrington, but as a person. One gray afternoon, I stood across from the Connecticut estate for the last time. It was quiet, as always. The white columns had started to yellow, and the hedges, once trimmed weekly, grew wild with time. A new brass plaque marked it as a historical site. The house would remain, but the dynasty that once ruled within it was now just a footnote in its paperwork. I walked the grounds slowly, letting my memories settle. There were no ghosts here, just echoes. I passed the garden bench where I once read through quarterly reports while Wallace painted on the veranda. The back terrace where my mother once hosted tea parties with silver spoons and veiled insults. The oak-lined path where I'd escaped to breathe when it all felt like too much. Now, there was space. Later that evening, back in the city, I sat in my apartment with a book I wasn't reading and a drink I wasn't sipping. The light from the window cast soft shadows on the floor, and for the first time in years, my thoughts weren't racing. No calculations, no balance sheets, just stillness. That's when I realized justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it arrives not as applause, but as absence. The absence of fear, of control, of manipulation. What I had gained wasn't just legal vindication, it was freedom. Not the loud kind, but the quiet, steady kind that shows up in small decisions, where to go, what to say, who to be. I was no longer the financial backbone of a broken family. I was no longer the solution to everyone else's crisis. I had no interest in rebuilding ties made of guilt and silence. I had built something better, myself, from the ground up, and I never looked back. Because the greatest justice wasn't that I exposed them. It was that I walked away and never needed them again. Eleanor Harrington's story isn't just about wealth or legacy. It's about the quiet burden so many carry when loyalty becomes a leash. Her courage to say, enough, didn't come from spite. It came from clarity. Clarity that love without respect is a transaction. That sacrifice, when unnoticed and unreciprocated, becomes exploitation. According to Dr. Miriam Lane, a financial psychologist who specializes in family dynamics and identity-based trust abuse, people like Eleanor often don't realize they're being drained until it's too late. They're conditioned to give, to fix, to hold everything together. And when they finally draw a boundary, they're labeled the problem. But in reality, they're the first to see clearly. This story invites us all to examine our own definitions of family, duty, and identity. At what point does helping stop being healthy? And when does silence become complicity? What do you think? Was Eleanor right to walk away? Or was there another path she could have taken? Let us know in the comments below. Your voice matters more than you think. And if this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear that it's okay to protect your peace, even if it means walking away from everything you've ever known.